The map of the modern economy begins not with factories, but with a hotel. In the summer of 1944, under the timbered rafters of the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from scores of allied nations signed a peace that did not simply end the war. It assigned a currency to the century. John Maynard Keynes, weary-eyed and brilliant, argued for a clearing union. Harry Dexter White, sharp as a banker's pen, argued for the dollar. The dollar won, tethered to gold, while others tethered themselves to the dollar. A fixed constellation was drawn in the night, green stars nailed to the sky. For a time the cosmos behaved, exchange rates held like iron gates. The United States stood as custodian of the vault, pledging that any nation could trade dollars for gold, as surely as saints trade prayers for hope. Yet in the 1960s, as the war in Vietnam burned money like a paper mill and great society promises gathered cost the way storms gather charge, the printing presses found a new rhythm. The French, who have a talent for the theatre of statecraft, sensed the music had changed. Charles de Gaulle's finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, lamented the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. French ships came to New York not with cannon but with paperwork, asking politely for bullion. The bars left Manhattan in discreet silence, like guests departing a party that had gone on too long. On the 15th of August in 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that dollar convertibility into gold would be temporarily suspended. The word temporarily, that merciful little fig leaf, covered a permanent nakedness. The Bretton Woods order became a floating world. Currencies learned to drift. Markets learned new appetites. Central banks learned to speak in riddles. In that same calendar of consequence, Henry Kissinger made his secret journey to Beijing. The door that had been shut since revolution creaked open in the humid summer of 1971. Kissinger, a scholar of power and its shadows, examined a different ledger. America faced a twin deficit of trade and budget, a stomach with bottomless cravings. Japan and West Germany sold superb machines to the world, and looked at American store shelves, unsure what to buy in return. A new anchor was needed, not hammered from gold, but drilled from the earth. Here is where finance becomes geology, and diplomacy becomes physics. Oil would do what bars no longer could. In the early 1970s, a series of understandings flowered in the desert. William Simon, at the Treasury, and his deputy Gerald Parsky traveled to Riyadh. King Faisal listened. The outlines took shape. Saudi Arabia would price oil in dollars, and dollars would circle back into United States treasuries. A petrodollar recycling system was born, an elegant siphon, feeding Washington's deficits while feeding Riyadh's votes. The energy of the world ran through a currency hose, and the nozzle sat in American hands. So, then the shock. Following the war of 1973 in the Middle East, OPEC raised prices with a severity that rattled the bones of industry. The price of a barrel multiplied. Daniel Yergin would later chronicle how the 20th century's price changed hands and habits. The dominoes fell into the pocketbooks of the West. Inflation crawled into every invoice. Central banks wrestled with a serpent they could not see, only feel. Economists bickered about causes. Some pointed at the embargo, others at the monetary accelerant already soaked into the wood. The result for ordinary homes was the same, a cold draft under a locked door. Beyond the headlines, another theater changed costumes. The imperial era ended with speeches, flags lowered at dusk, anthems played on out-of-tune horns. New nations were born by the dozen. In universities from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Cambridge, England, a fresh academic craft introduced itself as development economics. On the cover were mothers and irrigation canals. In the footnotes were the new twin pillars of the world's financial architecture, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both birthed in the same Bretton Woods cradle that had once held Keynes and White. Its catechism, later popularized as the Washington Consensus by the economist John Williamson, taught deregulation, liberalization, privatization, and the open window through which foreign capital would flow like a sweet breeze. The psychology of policy matters as much as the policy itself. The framing effect, measured by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, teaches that the way a choice is presented can govern the choice itself. Development, framed as a shortage of savings, cast poor countries as households earning too little and needing loans to bridge the month. The IMF and the World Bank offered conditional rescue, a medicine chest whose pills came with instructions that remade budgets and borders. Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness whispers a cautionary tale about institutions that train the subject to accept the cage as the room. When reforms are tied to lifelines, choice becomes choreography. On the ground, invoices tell more truth than manifestos. The economist Raoul Prebisch and his collaborator Hans Singer had earlier warned that over long stretches the prices of raw commodities fall relative to manufactured goods. It is the cruel arithmetic of the latter. If a country exports copper and coffee, and imports turbines and diagnostic machines, the trade balance turns into a slow-motion tragedy. Debt fills the gap. Interest compounds like ivy crawling up old stone. In the 1980s, Mexico rang the bell on a continent-wide debt crisis, and a generation learned the vocabulary of structural adjustment. Privatize the mill, cut the subsidy, float the currency. The figures lined up on spreadsheets in Washington like dominoes on a marble table. Walk any capital in the developing world and count the cranes, then count the customs warehouses. The promises were sincere, the outcomes inconsistent. Critics, including Ha-Jun Chang and Alice Amsden, took a torch to the orthodoxy. They pointed back to Friedrich List in the 19th century, who argued that infant industries need shelter before they face the cyclone strength of global competition. They pointed to the miracle of the post-war East Asian economies and asked a simple question. If free trade is the only ladder, why did those climbers build windbreaks as they ascended? Japan turned to a choreography of credit known colloquially as window guidance, with the Ministry of International Trade and Industry whispering priorities, and banks channeling loans towards steel, shipbuilding, and electronics. South Korea under Park Chung-hee harnessed the Chi-bol with a mixture of subsidies and stern targets, exporting like a team rowing for its life. Taiwan nurtured semiconductors through institutions like the Industrial Technology Research Institute. Singapore gathered talent like a meticulous watchmaker, using the Economic Development Board as both salesman and architect. Each of these societies managed domestic savings, not as a river evaporating into consumption, but as an irrigation system nourishing factories. The results were not ideological, they were statistical. Per capita incomes marched into the ranks of the developed. Then came China, a civilization continent that stepped into a different century in one leap. Deng Xiaoping, with a farmer's realism and a strategist's patience, opened windows while keeping the house frame. Special economic zones at Shenzhen and Xiamen allowed capital and discipline to meet. Small local banks sprouted across counties and cities, loan officers adjudicating the dreams of small manufacturers and township enterprises. Credit creation became a development instrument, rather than an uncontrolled spark on dry grass. The People's Bank of China and policy banks, such as the China Development Bank, backed railways, power grids, and ports. Hundreds of millions left poverty, a scale of social change not seen since the plow met the seed. By the early 21st century, the Washington Consensus showed its limits like a suit worn too long. Danny Roderick described a trilemma of globalization, democracy, and national sovereignty that no one could hold all at once. Others saw a simpler geometry. If the rules are written by creditors, the story will honor collateral. If the rules are written by traders, the chapter on factories will be thin. Development economics, in too many classrooms, felt like a script for managing scarcity rather than manufacturing plenty. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, first in Kazakhstan and then in Indonesia, a pair of speeches that sounded like blueprints rolled across a table. 4 years later, the initiative entered the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, a signal that this would not be a season but a generation. New institutions joined the stage. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank opened in Beijing. The New Development Bank, established by the BRICS nations, headquartered in Shanghai, invited projects that smelled of concrete and steel rather than seminars. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization deepened its security and economic dialogue. Suddenly, for ports from Gwadar to Piraeus and railways from Mombasa to Nairobi, there was an alternative financing window with a different set of conditions. The Belt and Road Initiative has its own psychology and it wears different clothes. Where the IMF arrives with covenants and quarterly reviews, Chinese policy lenders tend to arrive with engineers and lenders who speak the language of kilowatts and kilometers. Where Washington speaks of governance first, Beijing often speaks of roads first, promising that traffic will teach the rules. The appeal is obvious to leaders who must deliver electricity, water, and jobs before the next election or the next monsoon. It is also obvious to those who remember colonial balance sheets where the extraction exceeded the investment by an order of moral magnitude. None of this is a fairy tale. There are projects that sag under debt, there are contracts written with opacity, there are ports that glimmer as trophies and railways that creak as burdens. The controversy over Sri Lanka's Hambantota port shows how infrastructure can become a political Rorschach, a debt trap to some, a salvage operation to others. Yet a ledger has two columns. In Greece, the port of Piraeus under the stewardship of Costco transformed from rust to throughput. In Ethiopia, The Addis Ababa to Djibouti corridor became an artery for landlocked ambition. In Central Asia, dry ports began to mean something besides warehouses. Behind the concrete, a contest of monetary weather continues. The petrodollar that once felt like granite now feels like limestone. Saudi Arabia has explored energy trade, settled in currencies other than the dollar in select transactions, and China has pursued yuan pricing for oil futures in Shanghai. The psychology of reserve managers is shifting, not in panic, but in the quiet way that portfolio allocations change when the story behind them changes. When Daniel Kahneman wrote about the anchoring bias, he described how the first number offered in a negotiation sets the orbit for what follows. For decades, the number was the dollar. Now central banks from Southeast Asia to the Gulf hold more gold than they did a decade ago and talk about currency baskets as if this were natural. The question that stalks this century is not whether development economics exists, but what it is for. If the curriculum trains sovereign nations to accept a role as commodity farms feeding distant factories, then the subject is misnamed. If the curriculum instead teaches the mechanics of building a tax base, a manufacturing base, and a knowledge base, then call it nation building and stop pretending it is neutral. The names matter. So do the verbs build, protect, export, save, invest. Those are old verbs. They built Birmingham Steel and Yokohama ships and Suzhou microchips. Psychology helps decode the stalemates. Loss aversion means leaders fear the political cost of change more than they crave the gain from reform. Status quo bias keeps patronage in place long after the projects have stopped working. Social proof forces finance ministers to attend the same conferences and repeat the same phrases because deviation reads as risk. Yet outside the conference halls, mothers want clinics, farmers want storage, machinists want orders, and graduates want the dignity of a first paycheck. Development is not a seminar. It is a logistics problem with a human soul. Evidence cuts through rhetoric like a bright wire. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China moved from the category called developing to the ledger titled developed by following playbooks that blended markets with muscular industrial policy. They used domestic banks as engines, pointed at sectors with future pricing power, and protected infants until they were strong enough to face the cyclone. They did not perfect their economies with purity. They practiced with pragmatism. They climbed. Meanwhile, many nations taught to liberalize before they industrialized, ended up specializing in what the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis warned against. Copper gleams in a brochure and disappoints in a decade. Coffee perfumes a cafe and impoverishes a countryside. A nation that ships raw ore and imports finished machines has made an elemental mistake. It has chosen to sell low complexity and buy high complexity. That spread eats the future. The Belt and Road Initiative arrives as a counteroffer, not a sermon. Here is a dam. Here is a port. Here is a power plant. Here is a rail line. Repayment will be a negotiation, not a morality play. The critics warn of sovereignty at hazard. The supporters point to lights turning on in towns that never had them. The truth is patient. 20 years from now, the ledgers will tell whether throughput rose, whether exports diversified, whether local suppliers learned to weld to a global standard, whether schools sent engineers into plants rather than out of airports. There is a final reckoning that hovers over all of this. In 1942, the Allies used the phrase United Nations as a banner for wartime solidarity. In 1944, they gathered to design a monetary structure that would prevent the beggar thy neighbor devastations of the interwar era. The center held until it did not. The pivot from gold to oil was cunning, then durable, then fragile. What the Belt and Road suggests, in its steel and stone way, is that another pivot is underway, from a development doctrine of prescriptions to a doctrine of projects, from a financial empire that demanded policy as tribute to a commercial empire that demands trade as proof. Each has temptations and sins. If Washington wishes to lead, it will have to remember what leadership in development once meant on its own soil. The Tennessee Valley Authority did not ask Appalachia to privatize before it brought electricity. The interstate highway system did not demand that states deregulate before it poured concrete. Land-grant colleges did not insist that farmers float their currencies before teaching crop science. The United States became wealthy through long periods of strategic protection, ambitious public works, and state-guided science, stitched to a private sector that loved risk and hated waste. Europe's best chapters tell similar stories. At the edge of the map stand central bankers and sovereign wealth managers who study risk with the caution of surgeons. They recall Hyman Minsky's warning that stability breeds instability, and they see in commodity booms and capital surges the seeds of sudden stops. They track power laws in trade, the way a few supply chains dominate, and a few ports capture the lion's share of flows. They understand path dependence in institutions, the way early choices harden like lava into future streets. This is why the Belt and Road matters beyond geopolitics. It challenges development economics to earn its name. It asks the IMF and the World Bank whether their future is auditing or building. It asks the AIIB and the New Development Bank whether their future is engineering or empire. It asks ministers in Nairobi and La Paz and Dhaka to think not in election cycles but in power plant cycles, not in headlines but in export baskets. It asks citizens to measure promises not in adjectives but in freight tonnage and classroom headcounts. There will be more conferences. There will be more acronyms. There will be crises that come at night and rallies that arrive with sunlight. Somewhere, a finance minister will read Danny Roderick in the morning and meet a project finance team in the afternoon. Somewhere else, a central bank governor will lower a policy rate and raise a brow. In Riyadh, in Beijing, in Washington, portfolio managers will push 1% more into gold, 1% more into yuan assets, 1% more into credit that builds things, rather than just prices things. The anchors are moving. Not torn from the seabed, but lifted one chain link at a time. A final metaphor then, borrowed from the ports themselves. Development is a harbor. The ships that enter carry debt and dreams. The cranes lift containers filled with parts and plans. Harbor masters must watch the tide, the currents, the storms that distant nations call policy. For 75 years, one lighthouse has thrown most of the light. The Belt and Road lights another. Perhaps the lesson of this century will be what it should always have been. A real harbor needs more than one lamp, a breakwater that bends the waves, and merchants who understand that prosperity is not the loan you take, it is the cargo you ship.